He had buried her 10 years ago. Not in the ground, of course. There was no grave, no stone, no preacher to say her name. He'd buried her in that hollow place inside his chest, right where a man's heart is supposed to be. And for 10 years, he'd piled the days on top of her like stones, working cattle, mending fences, speaking only when a horse needed calming or a steer needed turning. The folks down in the valley, they had a name for him, the ghost on the ridge, a cowboy who'd lost his tongue. They were wrong. He hadn't forgotten how to speak. He just remembered too much. Some nights when the wind howled a lonely song through the pines, he'd sit by his fire and see her face in the smoke. Her eyes, burning with that fierce light that always seemed to look right through him. Then the smoke would break apart, and she'd be gone again, leaving him with nothing but the glowing embers and the same old lie he told himself every night. That love was just a wound, and a man could walk it off if he just kept walking. But that lie was getting heavy. Her leaving hadn't been a choice, not hers anyway. Her people had come, their faces like iron, their voices like the crack of a whip. She was theirs, they said, bound by blood, by laws older than the mountains. He'd just stood there, a statue made of helpless rage, and watched them drag her away into the dust. He remembered she turned back, just once. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open, but no sound came out. That was the image seared into his soul. He told himself she'd moved on, found a new life. He told himself the memory of him had probably faded to nothing. He told himself these things so many times he almost believed them. Tonight, a storm was coming. It started with a whisper in the pines, the kind that promises violence. He sat in the dark of his cabin as the first crack of thunder split the sky. Rain hammered the roof, a wild drumbeat shaking the old walls. He tossed another log on the fire, the wind pressing against the shutters like a living thing, begging to get in. It felt fitting. His own heart had been shuttered for a decade. But the storm was here anyway, and that's when he heard it. Softer than the thunder, gentler than the rain, but sharper than both. A knock on his door. He froze. His hand hovered over the fire iron. Nobody came up here. Nobody. The ranch hands stayed in the valley. The circuit preacher took easier roads. He hadn't heard a visitor's footstep in 10 years. The knock came again, faint, almost swallowed by the storm. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner. He stood up, the floorboards groaning, and he unlatched the heavy door. And there she was, or maybe a ghost wearing her shape. A woman bent and thin, gray hair plastered to her skull, a sodden shawl clinging to her bony shoulders. Her face was a road map of grief, her eyes lost in shadows. He blinked, thinking she was a stranger, some poor soul lost in the storm. He almost asked for her name, but then she looked up, and the firelight from the cabin caught her eyes, and the world stopped turning. He stepped back without a word and let her pass. She moved like a wounded bird, fragile and slow. She went straight to the fire, holding her pale hands out to the flames as steam began to rise from her wet clothes. They didn't speak. He just watched her, the same way he watched the fire every night, waiting for a pattern to make sense of it all. Her face seemed carved from sorrow. She looked ancient. Then she said his name, not like a question, but like a prayer she'd been whispering for 1,000 nights across 1,000 miles of hell. That one word broke him. He whispered her name back, the sound rusty and strange in his own ears. Elara? She lifted her head, and in the flickering light, he saw it. It wasn't age that had stolen her. Her hair was white, yes, but it wasn't the silver of years. It was the stark, dead white of pure terror, of a life lived in the dark. Her eyes, though tired, held that same fire he remembered. She wasn't old. She was a woman who had been dragged through something worse than time. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a ghost. This was real. But as she looked at him, her eyes weren't filled with the joy of reunion. They were wide with a fresh and terrible fear. And she wasn't just looking at him, she was looking past him, through the open door, into the howling darkness of the storm, as if she was terrified of what had followed her up the ridge. He shut the door, the heavy bolt sliding home with a deafening thud. The sound seemed to break the spell. She flinched, turning her gaze from the darkness outside to the fire inside. He watched her, his mind a whirlwind. 10 years of grief were crashing into one impossible moment of confusion. "Elara," he said again, his voice cracking, "what happened to you?" She didn't answer right away. She just shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. Finally, she spoke, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. She told him the story he'd always imagined, the story he'd tortured himself with for a decade. Her tribe's elders, a forced marriage to a cruel man, a life of duty that had bled the color from her hair and the hope from her heart. Every season had carved another line into her face. Every year had been a stone laid on her soul. He listened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every word was a hammer blow, confirming his worst fears. The powerlessness he felt that day came rushing back, hot and bitter. He had mourned her, but hearing the grim details of her stolen life was a fresh kind of agony. He wanted to rage, to smash something, to ride down to her old camp and burn it to the ground. But all he could do was stand there and absorb her pain. She told him she had carried the memory of him like a secret, a single warm ember in a world of ice. She said she was afraid to come back, afraid he'd have moved on, or worse, that his heart would have hardened with hate for her people. But the storm inside her had finally grown stronger than the storm outside, and it had driven her here. His anger softened, replaced by a wave of profound sorrow. He saw not the ghost, but the woman he loved, returned to him from the grave he'd built in his heart. The weight of 10 lonely years began to shift, not disappearing, but changing. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to prove that she wasn't a dream conjured by the storm. He took a step closer. The floorboards creaked. She looked so fragile by the fire, her thin shoulders slumped in exhaustion. A sudden fierce need to protect her surged through him. He knelt in front of her. "You're safe now," he whispered, the words feeling foreign, but true. He reached for her hand to offer comfort, to feel the reality of her skin against his. Her hand was cold, trembling. He wrapped his larger, rougher hand around hers. And that's when he felt it. Hidden beneath the frayed cuff of her sleeve, his thumb brushed against something that didn't belong. It was a mark on her skin. Raised, rough scar tissue. He gently pushed the sleeve back. It was a brand. A crude, ugly shape seared into her wrist. Not a tribal marking he'd ever seen. It was the kind of mark you put on cattle. A mark of ownership. His blood ran cold. She snatched her hand back as if his touch had burned her. A look of pure, animal panic flashed in her eyes, erasing the weary traveler and revealing someone cornered and terrified. "Don't," she breathed, her voice a choked whisper. "You don't understand." The hope that had flickered to life just moments before was instantly extinguished, replaced by a chilling dread. The story she'd told him, the neat, tragic tale of tribal duty, it suddenly felt thin, brittle, like a sheet of ice over dark, churning water. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy. The fire crackled, spitting sparks, but it offered no warmth against the cold that was now seeping into his bones. "What is that mark, Elara?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting inside him. She wouldn't meet his eyes. She stared into the flames, her jaw tight. "It's nothing, an old punishment." "A punishment for what?" he pressed. He saw the lie forming on her lips before she even spoke it. His heart, which had just dared to feel again, was now twisting into a knot of suspicion and fear. The woman in front of him was a stranger. 10 years was a long time, long enough for a person to become someone else entirely. "I tried to run," she said, her voice flat. "They brought me back. They wanted to make sure I never forgot my place. But it didn't feel right. The brand was ugly, brutal. It spoke of a cruelty that felt different from the stern traditions of her people. And her fear. It wasn't the fear of a painful memory. It was alive. It was in the room with them, breathing in the dark corners." He stood up and walked to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The storm was relentless. Blackness, wind, and sheets of rain. Nothing else. But he could feel it. The sense of being watched. The same feeling he'd gotten right after she'd looked past him into the night. "Who are you running from now?" he asked, not turning around. The silence that followed was his answer. It stretched and stretched until it was a tangible thing. A wall between them. The fire popped, a gunshot in the quiet. Finally she broke. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of a soul breaking apart. "The story I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It wasn't true." He turned slowly from the window. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "My tribe didn't take me," she choked out. "They think I ran away with you that day. They cast my name out. I have no people. I have no home." His mind reeled. A decade of grief, all of it built on a misunderstanding. He had hated her people for nothing. And she had been utterly alone. "Then who?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Who took you?" She lifted her head. Her face was a mask of terror, tears streaming through the grime on her cheeks. She didn't have to say a word. She just lifted a trembling arm and pointed. Not at the fire. Not at him. She pointed at the bolted door, at the window, at the raging darkness outside. "They're still out there," she cried, her voice cracking with hysteria. "They followed me, and they won't stop until they drag me back." The cabin, his fortress of solitude for 10 years, suddenly felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every gust of wind against the walls sounded like a fist. He grabbed the heavy rifle from its pegs above the mantel. The cold, familiar weight of the steel was a small comfort. "Who is they?" he demanded, moving to the door, listening. The story spilled out of her then, a torrent of horror held back for a decade. It wasn't her tribe. It was a band of ghosts, ruthless outlaws led by a man they called the Warden. They preyed on the isolated edges of the territory, taking what they wanted, leaving nothing but fear behind. They had ambushed her on the trail that day, moments after she'd left her camp to meet him. They had taken her. For 10 years, she had been their property. A servant, a cook, a prisoner. The brand on her wrist was their mark. The white hair wasn't from sorrow, but from a single night of terror years ago when she'd witnessed something so brutal it had bleached the life from her. She had lived in a waking nightmare, surviving on scraps of hope, waiting for a chance. "I finally got it," she said, her breathing ragged. 2 nights ago. The Warden was drunk. I ran. I've been running ever since." He checked the rifle, his movements automatic, his mind racing. A simple rancher against a whole band of killers. The odds were impossible. He had lived a quiet life for so long, his fighting days were a distant memory. But looking at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, he knew he wouldn't let them take her again. Not without a fight. "Why follow you all this way?" he asked, his voice grim. "Just for one runaway captive?" She shook her head, a new kind of fear dawning in her eyes. It wasn't just about being recaptured. It was something more. She reached into the folds of her wet shawl and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. "I didn't just run," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I stole something." His gaze dropped to the pouch. He expected gold, maybe jewels, something valuable enough to warrant a cross-country chase. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the knot. She emptied the contents onto the rough-hewn table between them. It wasn't gold. It was a folded oilskin map, creased and dirty. And next to it, a small leather-bound book, a ledger. "It's everything," she breathed, pushing it towards him. "The map leads to their main hideout, a place no one has ever found. And the book, it's the warden's records, every raid, every theft, every murder. It's all in there. Dates, names, amounts. A confession, a weapon, proof that could bring them all to the gallows." Now he understood. They weren't just hunting her. They were hunting the evidence that could destroy them, and she had brought it right to his door. Suddenly, a loud crash from outside made them both jump. It wasn't the storm. It was the sound of the corral gate being kicked open. His horses whinnied in panic. They were here. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. The howling wind was no longer just wind. It was filled with voices, real or imagined. Silas moved with a speed he hadn't known he still possessed, blowing out the lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the frantic, dancing light of the fireplace. "Stay away from the window," he hissed, pulling Alara down behind the heavy table. He peered through a tiny crack in the shutter. Shapes were moving in the dark, ghosts in the rain, at least 4 of them, maybe more. They were spreading out, forming a perimeter, surrounding them. The ghost on the ridge was about to have company. For 10 years, this cabin had been his tomb, a place to grieve. Tonight, it would either be his fortress or his grave. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The quiet man who mended fences was gone. Someone else was looking through his eyes now, someone older, colder, someone who knew how to survive. A voice cut through the storm, rough and cruel. "We know you're in there, girl. The warden is feeling generous. Bring us back what you stole, and he might let the cowboy live." Alara stifled a cry, pressing her face against the rough wood of the floor. Silas didn't answer. He just watched, his rifle steady. Let them think it was just her and some simple farmer. Let them get comfortable. Let them get close. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the storm, the crackling fire, and Alara's terrified breathing. Then another voice came from the darkness. This one was different, not just a follower. It was smooth, confident, and dripping with a chilling amusement. "No need to be shy," the voice called out, closer this time. "We're all old friends here, aren't we?" Silas froze. That voice. He knew that voice. It was a ghost from a different grave, a past he had buried even deeper than Alara. "Come on out, Silas," the voice continued, mocking him. "Or should I say, Jedediah?" Alara's head shot up. She stared at him through the gloom, her eyes wide with confusion. "Jedediah?" The name hit him like a physical blow. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in more than a decade. A name that belonged to a different man. A man who lived a life of smoke and blood. A man he had killed and buried right here on this ridge. His quiet life, his escape, it was all a lie. The past hadn't just found him. It had been hunting him all along. The voice from the darkness laughed, a low, cruel sound that seemed to slither through the walls. "Cat got your tongue, Jed. You've gotten quiet in your old age. I almost didn't believe it was you. Holed up in this shack, playing rancher. It's a sad sight." Silas's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. The man outside wasn't just any outlaw. It was Corbin, his former partner. The man he'd left for dead after their last job together went sour. The man he had betrayed to escape the life. Alara was still staring at him, her fear now mixed with a dawning, horrified understanding. "Who is Jedediah?" she whispered. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in. He was trapped by the storm, by Corbin's gang, and by the lies that had just crumbled around him. He had to tell her. He owed her that much. "It was my name," he said, his voice a low rasp. Before. Before I met you. He didn't have to explain what before meant. She could see it in his eyes. The quiet cowboy she had fallen in love with had never really existed. He was a character, a disguise. Underneath was Jedediah, a man who knew men like Corbin because he used to be one of them. He had come to this ridge seeking not just peace, but anonymity, a place to wash the blood from his hands, and now his sins had found her. This isn't a coincidence, he realized, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. They didn't just stumble upon you, Alara. Corbin's voice echoed his thoughts from the darkness. You really thought you could just walk away, Jed, after what you did. We've been looking for you for 10 years. But you disappeared like a ghost. Imagine our surprise when we grab a runaway squaw from some backwater tribe, and after a few years, she starts whispering your name in her sleep. The blood drained from Silas's face. It wasn't random, none of it. They hadn't taken her to punish her tribe. They had taken her to punish him. She was bait. A piece in a decade-long game of revenge he never even knew was being played. They had been holding her, waiting, hoping she would eventually lead them to him. And now she had. His entire world tilted on its axis. 10 years of her suffering, 10 years of his grief. It was all his fault. A debt called in from a life he thought he'd escaped. The weight of his guilt was heavier than any mountain. Give us the woman and the warden's ledger, Jedediah, Corbin yelled, his voice losing its playful edge, turning hard as iron. That's our price for you walking away from us. You give us what we came for, and we'll let you keep living this pathetic little life you've built. The offer hung in the air, thick and poisonous. His life in exchange for hers. The ultimate test. He looked at Alara. Her face was pale in the firelight, her expression unreadable. She had been a prisoner for 10 years because of him. She had suffered unspeakable things because of a man she never truly knew. He expected to see hatred in her eyes, accusation, blame, but he didn't. He saw a shared sorrow, a recognition. They were the same, her and him. Two people haunted by the past, trapped by circumstances they couldn't control. They had both been living a lie. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The guilt was still there, a burning coal in his gut. But it was joined by something else. A cold, hard resolve. He had run from his past for 10 years. He had hidden from it. And it had cost Alara everything. He wasn't going to run anymore. No deal, Corbin, he yelled back, his voice ringing with a strength he thought he'd lost forever. There was a moment of silence from outside. Then Corbin's chilling laughter. Wrong answer, Jed. I guess we'll just have to burn you both out. A torch flared in the darkness. Then another. They were going to set the cabin on fire, his sanctuary, his prison, his home. They were going to turn it into an inferno. He and Alara exchanged a look. There was no more time for words, for confessions or apologies. There was only the fight. He pointed her to the back room, the smallest and most defensible part of the cabin. Barricade the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. She held up the ledger. This is why they're here. This is the weapon. I'm not hiding. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. It hadn't been extinguished. It had just been banked, waiting for fuel. And his confession, his past, his fight, it had all become fuel. The first torch arced through the air, landing on the dry porch roof with a whoosh. Flames licked up the side of the cabin. Smoke began to curl through the floorboards. The siege had begun. The fire spread with terrifying speed, the old dry logs of the cabin catching like tinder. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to pour through the gaps in the walls. The heat was becoming unbearable. Outside, Corbin and his men were whooping and hollering, celebrating their victory. They thought they had them trapped. Silas fired through the window, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. A yelp from the darkness told him he'd hit one of them, but it was like throwing a rock at a tidal wave. Another torch hit the roof. The roar of the flames was deafening. "We can't stay here!" Alara yelled, her voice strained from the smoke. She was coughing, her eyes streaming. He knew she was right. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the roof came down. His mind raced, searching for an escape, an option he'd overlooked. There was none. The front door was suicide. The single back window was too small and faced the steepest part of the ridge. They were cooked. "The ledger," Alara gasped, clutching the small book to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "They can't get this." As the smoke thickened, turning the firelight into a hazy orange nightmare, she revealed one last, desperate secret. "It's not just a list of crimes," she coughed, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "There are names in here, big names. The territorial marshal, a land baron from the capital, even a circuit judge. They all paid the warden. They used his gang for their dirty work." The revelation hit Silas like a stray bullet. This wasn't just some backwoods gang of thugs. It was a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power in the territory. The law wasn't coming to save them. The law was on the outside, holding a torch. They weren't just fighting outlaws, they were fighting the system. A heavy beam from the ceiling crashed to the floor, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The heat was searing his skin. It was over. A decade of hiding, only to die in a fire, his past burning down around him. "We're not going to die here," Alara said, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce conviction. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him towards the dusty corner where his cot was. The very spot he had slept for 10 years, dreaming of her. "Move this," she ordered, pointing at the simple wooden frame. He didn't question her. Together they shoved the cot aside. Underneath, nearly invisible in the gloom, was a dark square outline in the floorboards. A loose panel. He'd lived in this cabin for a decade and never noticed it. She pried at it with her fingers, then with the butt of his knife. The wood groaned and came free, revealing a black, gaping hole. A root cellar. A hidden escape he never knew existed. "We can't let them get the book," she repeated, looking at him, her eyes burning with intensity in the fiery haze. "And we can't let them win." She shoved the ledger and the map into his hands. "Go, I'll be right behind you." He dropped into the darkness, the earth cool and damp beneath him. He looked up. Alara was framed against the roaring fire, a silhouette of defiance. She dropped down after him, pulling the floorboard back into place, just as the main roof of the cabin collapsed with a sound like the end of the world. They were in total blackness, the roar of the fire above them muffled by the earth. The air was cool and smelled of dirt and damp stone. They were alive. They had escaped. The cellar wasn't large. It led to a narrow, hand-dug tunnel that sloped downwards. They crawled on their hands and knees, Silas leading the way, the ledger and map clutched in one hand. The tunnel opened out into a thicket of pine and rock 50 yards down the ridge, completely hidden from the cabin. They scrambled out, gasping for fresh, rain-washed air, and looked back up the hill. His home was gone, a blazing skeleton against the night sky. Everything he owned, every remnant of his 10-year vigil, was turning to ash. It was a painful, cleansing fire. The ghost on the ridge had been cremated. Jedediah had been burned away. All that was left was Silas, the man, kneeling in the mud next to the woman his past had almost destroyed. They watched as Corbin and his men cautiously approached the inferno, convinced their enemies were burning inside. They would search the ashes later. When they found no bodies and no ledger, they would know. And the hunt would begin again. But this time, it would be different. Silas looked down at the map in his hands, then at Alara, her face grim and determined in the flickering, distant firelight. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold fire that matched his own. "They won't stop until we're dead," he said, his voice flat. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. He had a choice. They could take the ledger and run, disappear for good this time, spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Or they could turn and fight, not just for survival, for justice, for the 10 stolen years. "There's no one to turn to," he said, thinking of the marshal's name in the book. "The law is bought and paid for." Ilara met his gaze, and a slow, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Then we don't go to the law," she said. "We become the law." A new plan began to form in his mind, forged in the ashes of his old life. They weren't the hunted anymore. "They think we're ghosts," he said, a grim smile of his own forming. "It's time we started acting like it." He looked at the map. He knew these lands, he knew these kinds of men, and she knew their secrets. Together, they were something new, something dangerous. They were a reckoning, and they were coming for every last one of them. They didn't run. They vanished. For weeks, they moved like smoke through the territory, living off the land, guided by the grim roadmap in the warden's ledger. They became the ghosts Corbin thought they were, haunting the edges of his sprawling criminal enterprise. Silas, the former outlaw, knew the patterns of men who lived in the shadows. Ilara, the former captive, knew the secrets whispered when those men thought no one was listening. Their first target was a corrupt land baron named Fitzwilliam, whose name appeared frequently in the ledger next to notations about clearing squatters. They found his remote estate, a gaudy mansion built on stolen dreams. They didn't go in with guns blazing. They were smarter than that. They waited. They watched. They learned his routines. One night, while Fitzwilliam was hosting a decadent party for his wealthy friends, Silas slipped into his study and left the ledger open to the page detailing the baron's payments to the warden for arson and murder. Next to it, he left a single spent rifle cartridge, a quiet promise. Panic erupted. Fitzwilliam, terrified of exposure and convinced the warden's gang had turned on him, fled the territory, leaving his empire to crumble. His associates, fearing they were next, turned on each other like rats in a sack. The first crack in the marshal's corrupt foundation had appeared. Next was a sheriff in a dusty town called Redemption, a man who got rich turning a blind eye to the warden's smuggling operations. Ilara, using the knowledge she'd gleaned over years of servitude, knew about a hidden cache of weapons the gang kept in the caves outside of town. They didn't steal the weapons. They moved them. They placed the entire illegal arsenal in the back room of the sheriff's own office, then sent an anonymous tip to the town's newspaper editor, a firebrand idealist who hated the sheriff. The scandal exploded. The sheriff was ruined, arrested by his own baffled deputies. The gang lost a key ally and a major supply route. They were bleeding, and they didn't even know who was cutting them. With every victory, Ilara grew stronger. The haunted, terrified woman who had collapsed at his door was gone. In her place was a sharp, calculating strategist. She saw angles he missed, understood motivations he overlooked. The 10 years of trauma had forged her into a weapon. She was taking her power back, piece by piece. As they sat by a small, smokeless fire one night, studying the map, she traced a line with her finger. It led to the lands that had once belonged to her tribe. "I know why they were there," she said softly, a new, terrible understanding dawning in her eyes. It wasn't just a random raid. It was business. They investigated. They uncovered the final, sickening piece of the puzzle. The land her people had lived on for generations was worthless scrub, except for one thing. The river that ran through it was the only reliable water source for 100 miles. And the corrupt marshal, a silent partner in Fitzwilliam's land-grabbing schemes, wanted to control that water. The attack on her tribe, her kidnapping, it was the first move in a long campaign of terror designed to drive her people off their ancestral home. The warden's gang had been the marshal's private army. Eventually, broken and terrorized, the tribal elders had sold the land for pennies on the dollar to a front company owned by the marshal. Her own tribe hadn't cast her out in anger. They had been shattered. The elder who had declared her name forbidden had done so with one of the marshal's men holding a gun to his son's head. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a hostage negotiation. The weight of this final truth settled on them, heavy and cold. This was bigger than revenge for Silas's past. It was bigger than justice for Ilara's stolen years. It was about reclaiming a future for an entire people. "We can't just dismantle it," Ilara said, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. "We have to burn it to the ground. We have to expose all of them, especially the marshal." Silas knew she was right, but the marshal was untouchable, surrounded by bought and paid for lawmen. A direct assault was suicide. They needed a different kind of weapon. His eyes fell on a name in the ledger they had so far ignored. A young journalist in the territorial capital, noted as a potential problem. The warden had been planning to silence him. "If the law is corrupt," Silas said slowly, an idea forming, "then we need a higher court." He looked at Ilara. The court of public opinion. They had a new plan. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was likely the last thing they would ever do. They were going to set a trap, and they were going to invite the whole world to watch. The territorial capital was a city of lies, a place where justice was bought and sold in smoky back rooms. Silas and Ilara arrived looking like just another pair of weary travelers, their faces hidden by dusty hats and downcast eyes. They found the office of the newspaper, the Territorial Clarion, and its young, ambitious editor, Frederick Theron. They didn't give him the ledger. Not yet. They gave him a story, a taste, an anonymous tip about Sheriff Miller in Redemption, and a detailed account of his connection to a smuggling ring, complete with dates and locations that could be verified. They left the note in his mail slot and disappeared back into the city's shadows. 2 days later, the story was on the front page. Theron had done his homework. The Clarion caused an uproar. For the first time, someone had dared to print the truth. Now they had their ally. The next step was to set the trap. Using a page torn from the ledger, Silas sent a message to his old partner, Corbin. The note was simple. It said he had the full ledger and was willing to sell it back. The meeting place. The warden's original, now abandoned hideout in the Deadwood Canyons, the location from the map. The price, an impossible sum of money and safe passage out of the territory. He signed it Jedediah, a name he knew Corbin couldn't resist. He sent a second, different message to the marshal himself. This one, written in Ilara's hand, purported to be from a panicked Corbin. It claimed Jedediah was alive and was planning to turn the ledger over to the federal authorities. It urged the marshal to come to the Deadwood hideout with his best men to intercept the exchange and silence everyone involved, for good. The bait was set. They were luring 2 of the territory's most dangerous predators to the same location, hoping they would tear each other apart. Finally, they sent a third package to the journalist, Theron. This one contained a detailed map to the hideout, a summary of the ledger's contents implicating the marshal, and a simple message. "Come to Deadwood Canyon at sundown tomorrow. Justice will be served, or we all die." It was a hell of a gamble. They were counting on a journalist's ambition, a lawman's corruption, and an outlaw's greed. The next evening, as the sun bled across the canyon walls, Silas and Ilara were in position, hidden in the rocks high above the hideout. They were armed with rifles, a few sticks of dynamite salvaged from an old mine, and the terrible weight of the last 10 years. This was it, the final confrontation. Corbin and his men arrived first, cautious and alert, their rifles ready. They swept the abandoned camp, finding it empty. A few minutes later, the marshal arrived with a dozen of his own men, not deputies, but hand-picked enforcers. They looked more like a posse than lawmen. Corbin and the marshal met in the center of the camp. There was no friendly greeting, just the cold, hard glint of suspicion in their eyes. "Where is he?" the marshal demanded. "I thought he was with you," Corbin sneered. And in that perfect moment of confusion, Silas lit the first fuse. The dynamite exploded, not in the camp, but on the narrow canyon trail behind the marshal's men, sending rock and debris showering down, sealing the only way out. He lit the second fuse and tossed it behind Corbin's men, blocking their retreat. They were all trapped in the canyon together. Panic erupted. The marshal's men, thinking Corbin had betrayed them, opened fire. Corbin's gang, thinking the same of the marshal, fired back. The canyon became a kill box, a whirlwind of ricocheting bullets and angry shouts. It was chaos, exactly as they'd planned. From their perch, Silas and Alara provided the final, crucial ingredient. They weren't trying to kill everyone. They were orchestrating the battle. A shot from Silas's rifle kicked up the dirt at the marshal's feet, making him think Corbin was shooting at him personally. A bullet from Alara's gun tore through the hat of Corbin's lieutenant, convincing him the lawmen were executing them. The two groups tore each other to shreds. In the midst of the mayhem, the marshal spotted Silas up on the ridge. "Jedediah!" he roared, his face purple with rage, and started scrambling up the rocks toward him, his men providing cover fire. At the same time, Corbin, finally realizing the true nature of the trap, saw Alara. He recognized her, his prize, his property. He abandoned the fight and charged toward her position. The final battle had split into two personal duels. Silas met the marshal on a narrow ledge. The man was a bull, strong and furious, but Silas was quicker. He was no longer Jedediah the killer. He was Silas the survivor, fighting for his future. They fought, hand to hand, a desperate, brutal struggle on the edge of a cliff. Meanwhile, Alara didn't run from Corbin. She led him on a chase through the rocks, a terrain she now knew as well as he did. She used the traps of evasion and cunning that 10 years of his cruelty had taught her. She led him right into a dead end, a small box canyon. As he cornered her, his face lit with a triumphant, evil grin. He didn't see the rope snare she had laid until it was too late. He was hoisted into the air, caught by one leg, disarmed and helpless. She didn't kill him. She just looked up at him, her face calm and victorious, and left him there to be found. On the ledge, Silas finally got the upper hand. He disarmed the marshal, the man's gun clattering into the abyss. The marshal stood there, beaten and exposed, but Silas didn't throw him off the cliff. He just knocked him unconscious. Justice wasn't his to deal. As the last shots of the firefight below echoed and died, a new sound filled the canyon, the thunder of hooves. The journalist, Theron, had come, and he hadn't come alone. He had brought the one thing the marshal couldn't buy, a troop of U.S. Marshals from outside the territory, drawn by the promise of the biggest story of their careers. They rode into the canyon to find a scene of utter carnage, dead and wounded outlaws and corrupt lawmen. The territory's top law enforcement officer unconscious and bound. The region's most feared outlaw boss dangling upside down from a tree. And sitting on a rock, waiting for them, were Silas and Alara, the full ledger resting on their knees. The ghosts from the ridge had won. The ashes of the cabin were cold. They stood on the spot where his home had been, the place where 10 years of sorrow had lived and died. It was all gone. But for the first time, the ridge didn't feel lonely. It felt quiet. It felt peaceful. The trials had been swift. The warden's ledger was an undeniable confession, and with Alara's testimony, the entire corrupt network collapsed like a house of cards. The marshal, Corbin, and their surviving men were all headed for a federal prison, or worse. The truth, printed in blazing headlines in the Clarion, had washed the territory clean. Alara's tribe, their name cleared, was given back their land by federal decree. The elders sent word asking for her to come home. She was no longer an outcast. She was a hero. She and Silas stood on the ridge, the wind gently whispering through the pines. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked through hell and come back, not broken, but forged into something stronger than steel. The white of her hair no longer looked like a mark of terror, but a crown of survival. "Will you go back to them?" he asked, his voice quiet. She looked out over the valley, towards the lands of her people. "It's my home," she said, "but it's not the only one." She turned and looked at the ashes at their feet. "We could rebuild this one, together." He reached out and took her hand. Not the one with the brand, but the other. Her skin was warm against his. The brand was still there, a scar that would never fade. But it was no longer a mark of ownership. It was a reminder of what she had survived, a testament to her strength. He had scars too, just as deep, just as permanent. They didn't have to hide them anymore. He pulled a fresh, clean log from the pile he'd cut before the storm. He laid it across 2 stones, the first piece of a new foundation, a new beginning. The deepest scars sometimes lead to the strongest foundations. What do you think? Was their final plan an act of justice, or did they just become the very thing they were fighting against? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and long overdue revenge, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.